Today we're going to be looking at representative and responsible government. So in the Westminster system, there's two key features of that, representative and responsible government, often talked about together. The idea with representative democracy is that the people are, or governments are elected by the people and therefore should act in the best interests of the people. So when you have an election, representatives are voted in through electorates. There's in the House of Representatives, which is the lower house for the federal parliament, there's 150 representatives that represent the views of Australians. When they get elected, they're meant to represent the views of the majority. So they have this concept called an absolute majority, and that's this 50% plus one. So for someone to get elected and for a vote to pass in Parliament, they have to have 50% plus one of the preferences. So if you voted for someone and you didn't get your first choice, then your second choice gets represented, and so on until there's a person that's elected that has the majority of support. The government is formed by the party or coalition with 50% plus one of seats in the lower house. Now, we've got a bicameral system, which means we've got two houses in every state apart from Queensland, and the lower house is referred to as the House of Government. It's where government's formed, and the upper house acts as a house of review. It's very difficult for minority groups to get seats in the lower house. In Canberra at the moment, there's only 5 independents and a Green, and the rest are Labor, Liberal and Nationals. Minorities are more likely to be represented in multi-member electorates. So in the Tasmanian lower house, we have a multi-member electorate, and therefore we have more members of the Greens. And the Senate federally is a multi-member electorate as well, with each state having 12 representatives. The Senate's referred to as the State's House or the House of Review. However, in the recent election, 25% of the vote went towards minority groups, and that's been growing since the 1950s. The other thing about representative democracy is that you have to have periodic elections. So every 3 to 4 years, there has to be elections, because if the government is no longer representing the needs of the people or the needs of the majority, they can be voted out, or other parties can be voted in, depending which way you look at it. So let's have a look at some of the numbers from the past 2 federal elections. So you can see the map here of Australia. Each of the electorates is there to represent a certain amount of people. For ease of maths, let's say that each electorate is to represent 100,000 people. You can see electorates like Kalgoorlie over in Western Australia that are really big because the population is spread out. Within the suburbs of Sydney, there might be 1 member per suburb. Denison, for example, in Tasmania represents the city of Hobart, whereas Lyons goes from the west coast to the east coast of Tasmania down here. So, as I said before, 150 representatives in the House. In the 2013 election, there was 80 Liberals. We'll call Liberal National Party part of that as well at the moment. There was 10 Nationals, 55 Labor and 5 other. In the 2016 election, 66 Liberals, 10 National, 69 Labor and 5 other. So for a party to form government, they need to have 50% plus 1 of the vote. So if there's 150 total, we need to work out what 50% plus 1 is of that. So if we halve it, that's 75, and plus 1 equals 76. So if we look up to the numbers again, in 2013 it was very clear that there was enough Liberals to form government. If we look over the 2016 election, none of the parties actually have 76. So what has to happen is, and this happens through a formal agreement, the Liberal and National parties, so these two parties here, they form what's called a coalition. And together, they're able to get those 76 seats that are needed to form government. This is fraught with a bit of danger because they only have that one seat that's just holding them in power. And if someone was to defect or have a scandal or pass away, then their ability to hold government would be in danger. With elections being held 3 to 4 years apart, it's really important that governments are held to account between these times. So they're held to account by the people during elections, but the Parliament needs to hold government to account while they're in power. They do it through a number of ways. The first one is question time. You've probably seen this on the news, or maybe you've seen it on ABC TV, where the backbenchers and opposition ask questions of the ministers. They ask them questions to try and test them, to see what they might not have been doing so well. There are questions that can be provided by the government's own party, and these questions are normally really nicely worded. The ministers are prepared for those so that they can get positive media. They're known as Dorothy Dixer questions. Another way that governments can be held to account is through the upper house or the House of Review. So when they try and pass legislation through, it can act as a check on that. But also upper houses are a main form of committees where they can look at legislation in a lot more, in a lot greater detail, but also they can look at the way that governments are acting through the committees as well. The third way is through no confidence motions. Now, a no confidence motion is where either a government or a minister has a vote against them, and if they're unable to hold the amount of people in Parliament that they need, which is 50% plus one, and more than 50% plus one vote against them, then they'd be expected to resign. If it was a minister, at least to the backbench, or if it was a no confidence motion against the government, they'd be expected to go to an election. So let's have a look at the idea of ministerial responsibility. So we talked about no confidence motions being put towards ministers. There's an example that I have liked to use for a long period of time, and to understand ministerial responsibility, you need to understand the hierarchy of the public service. Now, I'm a teacher, obviously. With this pyramid here, I'm basically down the bottom of the hierarchy. Now, if I was to go on an excursion, part of the Department of Education, I might go on an excursion. If a student was to get injured or something was to go wrong, then I would be held to account as the teacher. However, there is a chain of command where pretty much that issue would go all the way to the minister to ensure that I was following the correct protocols and so on. So not just the teacher would be looked at in regards to responsibility, but also the AST, which is the head of an area, the principal of the school, the secretary, and then the minister. So to give you a bit more understanding around that, I'll talk about some of the people that we've got pictured here. So we'll start with Jackie Petrusma. So this is Jackie Petrusma here, just on the right. Jackie Petrusma is the Minister for Children's Services in Tasmania. Now, there was quite a few issues in 2015 around cases not being followed up in regards to reported child abuse and child neglect. And a no confidence motion was put against her towards Parliament because she was the minister of this. Even though she's not the one that's not following up the calls around the children's services, she is expected to ensure that the people within her department and within her area are doing their job and they're following the right policies. That no confidence motion failed, so she's still a minister in the parliament. The second person here is Matthew Groom. He's the Minister for Energy in Tasmania. In 2016, there was an energy crisis, and a no confidence motion was put towards him about the way that he handled it. Once again, the government supported him. The no confidence motion failed, and he remains a minister. This is Will Hodgman. He's the Premier of Tasmania, and with him as well, as the Premier, he's seen as being able to organise his ministers, and a number of no confidence motions have been put against him. But as you're aware, he's still the minister, still the Premier. The people down the bottom are examples where they actually have had to resign from their posts. So this person here is Adam Brooks. Now, Adam Brooks was the mining minister, and he actually had a number of companies, but one of those was a mining company. He was accused of continuing to use his email address for his mining company while he was the mining minister, having either a real or a perceived conflict of interest. After a period of time when this was being examined, he was asked to stand down. He was suspended from his role, but then he resigned. When he resigns, he goes to the backbench, doesn't resign from Parliament. The man over here is Steve Cons. Now, Steve Cons was the Deputy Premier of Tasmania, and he was the Attorney General. Now, the Attorney General was responsible for appointing judges and magistrates, and he was asked in Parliament whether he changed his mind about the appointment of a magistrate. He said no, that wasn't the case, and then a politician, Kim Booth, who was a member of the Greens, pulled out a letter that had been grabbed out of the bin, put back together after it had been in the shredder, that proved that what Steve Cons was saying was wrong. This became known as Shreddergate. The issue wasn't so much just about the change in mind about the appointment, but it was about the lying to Parliament, which is seen as being one of the worst mistakes that a minister can make. So we've got a number of examples here. I'll just go through their names again. So we've got Jackie Petrusma on the top right, Matthew Groom, Will Hodgman, Adam Brooks, who was the Minister for Mining, and Steve Cons with Shreddergate. With most of the questions in regards to representative and responsible government, you're not just required to know what they are, but you need to analyse them in some way. If it was a short answer, the analysis is brief. If it was an essay, then it's a longer analysis. So with representative government, it's helped by ensuring that the majority is represented through the principle of an absolute majority, both through electorates and in the House. However, there's problems around this because it might not represent minority groups well, very difficult for groups that have, say, 10 to 20% support, such as the Greens, to get elected into the lower house federally. It can be representative by having coalition or minority governments, but that can cause issues with those smaller parties holding the balance of power, basically holding governments to ransom. With responsible government, we've got question time, which is a fantastic way of making sure that the public see through the news and so on whether ministers are doing a good job. However, much of that time is taken up by Dorothy Dixer questions, which are questions about how well the minister's doing and pre-prepared from the backbench of their own party. We've also got the role of the Senate, which is able to make sure that governments are responsible through the committees and through the review of legislation. However, party politics can come into play, and it would be very rare for a party politician to not follow their own party. We've got no confidence motions. However, they're rarely successful, might be viewed as a stunt. So there's a number of no confidence motions that have been put forward by the Greens or by opposition parties against recent governments. Very few have actually succeeded. And we've also got the separation of powers, which is even more important in Australia because of the overlap between the legislature and the executive. However, Parliament is sovereign and they can re-legislate to ensure that any laws that they want are intra vires or within their powers. Finally, here's an example of an exam question that you might have. This was written for a mid-year short answer question. So it says the Australian Westminster system is founded on the ideals of representative and responsible government. Explain these concepts and briefly evaluate the barriers to their success. I think you could use most of the information in this presentation towards that, and I hope that you've got enough out of this presentation to make it worthwhile. Thanks for your time.